Okay, we're ready to begin. And my name is Dan Smith. I'm Director of SIPRI, and really wish you warmly welcome here for this meeting after the INF Treaty. A conversation with Patricia Lewis, who's the most important single position in life is that she's a member of the governing board of SIPRI, and therefore one of my bosses, and I will be unusually kind to her as a result. Patricia is the director of the Armament Disarmament Programme at Royal Institute for International Affairs in London, Chatham House. In the past, you've been, director of UNIDIR, the UN Disarmament Research Institute. You've been deputy director at the Centre for Non-Proliferation in Monterey, and director of VERTIC, Verification Technology Information Centre, back in the day.
Which is where we first met.
Yeah. More years ago than we will comment on this afternoon.
Exactly.
And also with Dr. Ian Anthony, who is a senior researcher and program director of the European Security Programme here at SIPRI, and actually also my predecessor as it was interim but nonetheless director of SIPRI. And what we're going to do is have a conversation, and after about 40 minutes or so, so approximately halfway through our time this afternoon, I'm going to open it up and ask you to be contributing with questions, thoughts, comments, and so on. The INF Treaty, as I think everybody in this room probably is aware, is or has been a core part of the arms control architecture which we have lived with from the end of the Cold War until now. And agreed in 1987, it wasn't the first sign of a breakthrough in relations between the US and the USSR towards the end of the Cold War. I think the first signs had come earlier with the Reykjavik summit and other high-level statements on both sides, in fact. But it was one of the first real products of that process of ending the Cold War. And it was particularly symbolically important in Europe, of course, because it also ended what had been a really major issue, one of the defining issues in European politics of the 1980s, which was the deployment of the cruise and Pershing missiles in the NATO European, or some of the NATO European countries, and of the SS-20 missiles in the western parts of the USSR. So then that was part of the architecture of arms control, and now in at a political rally in October last, Donald Trump said that the US was going to withdraw from the treaty. President Putin followed up after that was confirmed with withdrawing Russia from the treaty. Just for the technical record, the INF Treaty is not actually a bilateral treaty between the US and Russia, because the successor states from the Soviet Union that had at one point those weapons on their soil, they were also and are also parties to the treaty. That's Belarus, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan.
Yes, and I think you should also include that, the UK, Germany, Netherlands, Belgium were involved in the negotiation because of the inspections of the US weapons on this.
Is your thing on?
Is my microphone on?
Yes. Yeah, it is. Good. Okay, yeah.
So, I think that's important. At the time, they were not innocent bystanders.
No, they were real participants in the process. Yeah. Okay, so that's the INF Treaty. It was an achievement. It was important in practical, concrete terms, and it was important in political and symbolic terms. And it ushered in a new era. And now, that's the first question. We've called this meeting after the INF Treaty. Is that the right way to approach it? Is the INF Treaty actually a dead letter? Patricia first, and then Ian, your views on that.
I always leave a space for a little miracle. And so I'm not going to say that it's dead yet, but it's clearly on life support and it's clearly not doing well. It is not impossible that it could be reversed, and it would be miraculous if it were, but it looks very likely that what we're doing right now is entering a post-INF but more significantly, probably a post-bilateral nuclear arms control process. And that's what we need to get into.
So we'll get to that. Ian, what's your view? Dead letter or on life support?
No, I agree with Patricia. It's technically possible that something could happen in the next couple of months, but so unlikely that we probably should be talking about a post-INF period. I agree that probably the most important thing that the INF accomplished when it was signed was it was such a tangible signal that two very entrenched, ideologically opposed foes were now willing to do serious business together. So the question is whether the loss of the treaty also bookends this period of cooperation, and whether now the narrative of competition, which we see in the top-line documents of some of the major powers, is the paradigm that we have to think about.
Well, so that's the question, and the answer is?
Yes, obviously things have changed very fundamentally, I think, in the last few years. So if you think of the balance between the different components of security and defense policy, positive measures including defense and deterrence, restraint measures including arms control, confidence and security building, and diplomacy, the balance has clearly shifted in favor of the first. The positive measures mainly focused on defense and deterrence, and there things are moving quite quickly. In the area of restraint measures, things are also moving quite quickly, but in the opposite direction.
Patricia?
Yeah, that's true. I would say, though, that it's a moment for us to pause and have a look at the bigger picture. So the interesting question for me is, what on earth are we doing going back to nuclear weapons, which were a weapon of the Cold War, a weapon that was really designed in the Second World War, that saw its way through the Cold War, and what place do they have today? I think this is the question we need to ask in the bigger picture. We have so many other threats, right? We have climate change, probably our very biggest threat right now to humanity, to European security. We have big cyber threats. We have population problems. We have political volatility. We have so many other things going on that nuclear weapons cannot address. So what are they addressing? What is it that we still have this hankering for them in our societies when most of the world doesn't have that desire at all?
So do you think, I mean, one bit in there that you said going back to nuclear weapons. If we look at what this situation, what it means, right? Do you think it means more or less inevitably a new nuclear arms build-up, or if not a build-up in numbers, a sort of what you could call almost like a qualitative build-up? In other words, more emphasis on nuclear weapons in the strategies of the great powers?
It could mean that. It could mean that people actually say, hang on a minute, what are we doing? What do these weapons solve for us? And I'm very interested to see now that in Congress we have some moves in the US Congress to halt the withdrawal from the INF Treaty, and certainly to halt new nuclear weapons from being developed as a result. We have a no first use approach that's being promoted as well. And I think many of us are quite concerned about what might happen with other treaties, such as the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty that stops nuclear weapons testing, and also that what might then happen with the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty.
Okay, let's try to distinguish out what the consequences flowing from the INF Treaty ending seem like they will be in terms of military preparations, the relations between the US and Russia, and then look at what the kind of alternative thinking, which it might provoke almost by way of a backlash, would be. But Ian, where do you think the consequences take us? Is it towards a new arms race or something different, or should we not be worried after all?
We should definitely be worried. I think it's you can already see some of the decisions being taken. We've seen in Russia, apart from the development and deployment of a non-compliant missile, what looks like a decision to produce a ground-launched version of the Caliber missile, which has a range that would be captured by the INF Treaty. You've seen on the United States side responses, the development of a new ground-launched variant of cruise missile, the intention to produce a nuclear-armed sea-launched cruise missile, the initial phases of developing an intermediate-range ballistic missile. So these military responses are already taking place. Inside Europe, we have the discussion a couple of weeks ago in the Ukrainian National Security and Defense Council with a decision to leave the INF Treaty and begin the development of a non-compliant cruise missile in Ukraine. So these decisions are being taken. In NATO, you have the initiation of a new discussion of defense and deterrence posture. And I think that really focuses on the European dimension of this. What's lacking to a certain extent is a coherent European response as some of these things are happening around us. Then the question of what does that mean for the role of nuclear weapons? Some of those systems will, of course, be nuclear. The assumption is that the non-compliant missile developed by Russia has a dual use and will have a nuclear element. But the ground-launched version of Caliber need not necessarily be. It could be an expression of Russia's interest to join the precision conventional weapon club, if you like. And similarly, the European component of a strengthened defense and deterrence posture probably won't have a nuclear component, at least not directly. There will be consequences for the future of extended deterrence. I think that's a discussion which is coming. But European contributions, I would say, are quite unlikely to be nuclear. And the Secretary General of NATO has already said that this is not something they're thinking about, the deployment of new nuclear-armed intermediate-range forces. So we need to disaggregate this a little bit. The nuclear element of extended deterrence is something that we really do have to think about more carefully in Europe in the coming years.
Well, if we're thinking about extended deterrence, you put that into a context where we're thinking about what US-European relations have been in the past couple of years, when we've seen some quite, sort of unprecedented statements by American president, and we've seen unprecedented response, in a way, from some European leaders. I mean, Angela Merkel famously saying, that we can no longer rely on some of our traditional allies. How do you think does that political context get somehow simplified by the decisions to withdraw from the INF Treaty? Does it become more complicated? Is it more complicated from a kind of what you could call a traditional NATO point of view? Is it more What are your thoughts on how the politics of this play out?
I think it is complicated, and I was actually quite surprised with the way NATO responded, given that, to me, what I see is that Russia's been trying to alter or destroy the INF Treaty for quite a while, and that this was a moment for them which was a gift, in which
when President Trump withdrew.
When President Trump decided to withdraw, that meant that most of the world would then blame President Trump. So it's a propaganda gift for Putin. It gets what he wants, and I think it divides our already quite divided societies. I think it could make, if we go down more and more nuclear arms, and I think Ian's right that we need to really think much more about conventional forms of deterrence, which in the UK is being called modern deterrence, where we're looking much more at the full spectrum of deterrence capabilities. And for that, you really have to understand what it is you're deterring, what deters, understand the belief system of possible adversaries. It's a whole range of things. And not rely, if you like, on this big, unusable weapon, and which has come almost synonymous with the word deterrence, nuclear weapons. So I think that there's a lot of thinking to do, but what I would like to see is a lot of creative thinking about how to use this situation politically, how to not play into the propaganda machinery of Russia, which has been, in some ways quite successful, in other ways very clumsy and ham-fisted, and how to start a different kind of conversation about European security or international security in every crisis there's an opportunity, and how do we collectively take this opportunity now? And I know you want us to keep talking about the problem, but I like to talk about the solution, so I'm going to keep taking it.
No, we'll edge into the solution sooner or later, but where are you? What would be your response to that rather vague and fuzzy question I asked? I mean, how do the politics of this and of the context of transatlantic relations affect the situation, the decision-making processes now?
I think the politics will be very much impacted by the decisions made on capabilities, actually. If you look again at the responses, and if you look at the current pattern of extended deterrence, including its nuclear dimension, you can see that there could be some changes which would have very clear political consequences. What's meant by that? Extended deterrence has essentially had two elements. One is the assurance that any crisis has a response, even if it's a confrontation with a nuclear-armed adversary. And so for that, it's been necessary, or seen to be necessary, to have nuclear forces beyond what the US requires for defense and deterrence in the continental United States. And they're certainly thinking about that in the response to INF, but the responses are offshore. It's the designation of low-yield warheads on submarines and the development of a sea-launched cruise missile. So they're not on the continental Europe. The other part of extended deterrence has been broad participation, what's always been called broad participation. And this is becoming more difficult to sustain. It's depended on dual-capable aircraft which deliver nuclear gravity bombs. The modernization of those dual-capable aircraft may see, for example, Germany leaving the nuclear mission, possibly also Belgium. Although Turkey is committed to buy the F-35, whether this will ever be consummated as a result of the disagreements over Russian military supplies remains to be seen. Within a relatively short space of time, we may see the European component of broad participation reduced even further. Well, the politics of that in conditions where we're already talking about burden sharing again, this debate is coming up. The question will be, well, what are you Europeans doing to contribute to defense and deterrence? And I think this is really something that we need to think through. What is actually the future of the European contribution? Will it be, for example, the development of a serious conventional strike capability, non-nuclear? Something where every ally in theory could participate. Would this be part of the discussion? I think these are the kinds of issues which are likely to come onto the table, and the way in which those questions are answered will impact on the transatlantic political discussion.
Because it will either be seen to be either strengthening or weakening the European side of the contributions to NATO, and therefore through that strengthening the partnership.
Well, the risk is that Europeans are seen to be stepping away from one more commitment in what's supposed to be a balanced relationship.
Can I just add to that, though, because I think the Europeans could reframe that and say, look, we're all about the rule of law. This is about effective multilateralism. It's all about upholding the rule of law internationally. It's about supporting the United Nations. It's about supporting NATO, the European Union. Withdrawing from treaties is not about the rule of law. That's not how you do it. So let's come back to where we want to be, which is about a system of behavioral practices, norms, and legal requirements and obligations that people respect. And when there are problems, such as a violation, which there have been, that the answer is not necessarily to just walk away from the treaty. There are many other things that you can do that would actually hold Russia's feet to the fire much better and not have just handed this propaganda gift. And I think the propaganda gift is very important and will be used quite a lot around Europe and other parts of the world as well to demonstrate just how an unreliable ally Trump is for the Europeans. So I think we have a very delicate road to travel now. With the United States and its future. It's not just about President Trump, it's about the way the United States is going, but it's also about the way Europe is going and what Europe stands for. And that really matters in terms of messaging and in terms of coherence within Europe.
So before we move into this, the creative alternatives, but maybe it will turn out to be a pathway into it. We're talking about nuclear weapons technology, and we've talked about conventional weapons a bit. There's also the newer dimensions of technologies that are being applied in the military sector. Artificial intelligence, the issues that are raised in what is normally called cybersecurity, the virtual world. And how do you think, or do you think that these newly emerged technologies, which are being explored and exploited in the military sector now, do you think they also have an impact, an effect in the strategic and political discussion after the INF?
Yes. Yes, very much so. So if we just look at weapons systems, so there's two big issues for me. One is whether or not they're nuclear armed or conventionally armed, and dual capable is a real problem in this regard. They are going to be very fast with no time for decision making. That's been the case throughout the Cold War, by the way, and we've had a number of near misses, if you like. I think in the case now where we have the capability, we will be relying more and more on artificial intelligence to work out what's going on for us. And what we've seen in cases where, for example, drone use, where people rely on machine analysis, is that although the human makes the decision, really and truly, he or she has very little choice other than to make the decision that the machine tells them to make, because there is no time. In the battlefield. It's different, I think, when you're in a civil situation and you've got time to work things out, but in the heat of battle, there is no time. So we've got some real problems with new technologies and the way that our brains work and the way that machines work and the way we interact with machines. So that's number one. The second thing is information integrity. The way in which information can be digitally manipulated so that we don't know it's been manipulated, and whether that information goes to a machine that does something like an industrial control system or a command and control system, or whether it goes into our brains, the thing is we don't know when it's fake. And when we have no time to make the decision and to double check and check back, we could be in a really difficult position where we could be acting on uncertain information. And how do we factor that then into this speed of decision making? And I think this is causing a huge problem for decision makers in crisis situations right now, and it will get worse before it gets better. So we've got to think these things through very carefully with the types of very dangerous weapons that we're able to use.
And Ian, again, what would your response be to my question? Do these newly emerged technologies play into this strategic political conundrum we face?
Yeah, of course, different technologies will play in different ways, but I think an interesting aspect of this is around investment. We've seen now over the last few years that there has been a progressive increase in the amount of money devoted to the military, and that's something which is likely to continue, at least for the medium term. So there are new resources available, and how will those resources be invested? That's an interesting question. Will it be to try to acquire near-term capabilities with things that are available today? Or will it be to think about how to move to new generations incorporating future technologies? Again, this is a very important question, and it's a reason why the European debate really needs to take more life than we've seen so far, because we need to be involved in shaping those decisions. How are these new resources going to be used? Also, are we going to continue to deploy these resources in the very fragmented way that we always have in the past? Or are we going to have some more meaningful collective approach to using resources in the most appropriate and effective way? We've just begun to dip a toe in that with the discussion in the European Union of the so-called defence package, but we really haven't come very far in that discussion. I was thinking the other day, it's very rare for an international organisation to be closed down, but one that we did close down was the Western European Union. We could actually do something like that today.
So last question before we really open up on the creativity side. One thing that we haven't looked at so much, oddly, in this brief conversation is actually West-Russia relations. I mean, even during the Cold War, and perhaps especially in, for example, in the 70s, the period of détente, but even to a degree during the 1980s when the perception was that tensions were much higher and new weapons were being deployed and so on. There were some arguments that saw the confrontation as essentially a ritual, right? And maybe a dangerous ritual, but a ritual. That the rivalry somehow was not for real. Is there a real rivalry, a real competition for power going on between the US and Russia at the moment? If the answer is yes, then that makes the breakdown of the nuclear arms control arrangements, which is not just about the INF Treaty, but potentially about New START as well, feel that much more dangerous. If the answer is no, there's no real basis for the rivalry, then this is something which, with time and good sense, opportunities can be managed relatively straightforwardly. What do you think about this? I mean, it's about power competition, about great powers.
It's a bigger question in a sense than the INF Treaty, but I think we have every reason to be concerned because of a shift in the way that countries are thinking about the use of military force, where we've seen to a certain extent a slight inversion. The United States trying to extract itself from long commitments to regional conflict. Russia, on the basis of an extended period of military modernization, provided with new tools to influence the political discussion. And we've seen in Ukraine, and we've seen in Syria, that Russia is prepared to go very far in using these instruments. So I think this is a question about the future of the European security system, not the fate of one treaty. Mm-hmm. The things which Russia would like to have achieved through the institutions that were created after the end of the Cold War haven't come to pass. There's no indication that there will be concessions on the things that Russia would really like to achieve. And as I say, Russia has signaled that if things can't be done one way, maybe they'll be done another.
Yeah, Russia's more than signalled that. I mean, I think the invasion of Ukraine was saying...
It's the British understatement.
I think so, yes. We could do more of that at the moment in the UK. The real economic competition is with China. It's between the US and China, and I think it could be between the EU and China, but I see quite a lot of cooperation with China, with the EU, in some regards. China, of course, is very keen on the rule of law. It's just they want the laws changed, right? So they want rule of law, but a different set of laws. It may be that Russia would like to end up there too, but they wouldn't necessarily want the Chinese version of the rule of law. So it seems to me that as a genuine competitor, Russia isn't there. So in that case, what is Russia doing in this regard? So I think one of the things it can do is it can reduce the discrepancy, if you like, of economic powers by causing chaos, by distracting, by undermining, and increasing, certainly domestically, the standing of the leadership in Russia. If that's what it is, then our response to it has to be very different, it seems to me, from the response that we're seeing right now. In a way, what we're doing is playing to it and creating a situation which is very conducive to that leadership right now. And I'm not sure that's helpful to Russia in the long run. So my belief is that there are many Russian people, as there were during the Cold War, who are really, really smart, who understand much better about what's going on than their leadership would have us believe, just as I think there are in the UK, by the way, on Brexit. But it's...
We're not going to go there, however hard you try.
But I think throughout the world that, people understand things differently. And it's not... When we talk about Russia as an entity, what we're talking about is this government at a particular time, not the whole of the Russian culture, not the whole of the Russian people, and the same with China, the same with the United States. So we need to think much more about the population and the people and the culture and the society and how we connect with that. And, we knew that during the Cold War. We understood that. And you mentioned INF Treaty. I was thinking back to the Helsinki process and the Stockholm Accord as well, which I thought was a really important moment in Cold War history and the end of it. But, that people-to-people approach, that hasn't gone away. I mean, people are traveling all the time out of Russia into Russia, so there is a lot more understanding of what real life is like for ordinary people in all of our countries, and that's what we should be trying to build on, I think, and in a sense undermine the propaganda from leadership. And there I come to the internet, but I will leave that for the next questions.
On you go.
All right, so, we have been in the world dealing with this new technology, which has opened up so much for us in terms of information, so that we no longer need memories, right? We just look it up now. We no longer argue at our dinner tables about who sang what and what film so-and-so actor was in. We Google it, or we do use a search engine, not necessarily Google. And I think that, the way in which the internet has allowed us to connect, but it's also allowed us to connect our machines. It's allowed us to be much more efficient. It's allowing us to reduce our carbon emissions. It has an amazing capability, and this is just the beginning. There are real problems with it, though. One of the problems is that some countries don't want their citizens to have complete unfettered access to information, and they try to control the internet. They will never be able to control it completely, but they will do their darndest to do that. So we're in the a battle at the moment, it seems to me, about the way in which we manage this new technology in the world. Never mind just about cyber attacks and all of those things that we're trying to manage, but also the way in which ordinary citizens have access to information through this great new technology. I would like to see everyone to have that type of access, but also to feel safe online. So trying to create that collectively seems to be really important. In the United Nations right now, we have 3 processes going on. We have a group of governmental experts that's going to be meeting again. We have an open-ended working group that's going to be talking about going forward in cybersecurity, and we have a new treaty negotiation on cybercrime. We need to be engaging all of us, everyone who uses the internet, in this debate, because it's vital to their health, and we need to establish norms and rules of behavior in cyberspace that we can all live with.
And now bring this back to after the INF.
So it's about relationships. It's about the way we manage our world. And there are some areas, such as space, such as cyber and the internet, where we, and the seas, where we have to use this in a common way. I don't want to refer to it as the commons, because I know that has a particular legal meaning. But it is nonetheless a common technology for us. So post-INF, it seems to me that if we could focus on going forward and thinking about how we might collaborate effectively with these new technologies in a way that doesn't just race to the bottom of the lowest common denominator politics. It's a big ask, I know, and I'm not sure everyone has the answers, but that seems to me where we could spend a lot of our time right now developing common understandings, at least, capacity to understand that in diplomats. How do diplomats from over 190 countries really understand what's going on in the internet to be able to deal with this issue properly? That seems to me like a really important approach we could take.
It feels to me as if when we look at this sort of the horizon, we scan the possibilities in the potentially post-INF world, both short-term and long-term. We look at what seems to be pretty clearly now a breakdown in the relationship between the US and Russia that there was, for example, or the Western Russia, that there was for the first period after the end of the Cold War, which we probably in the West thought was persisting much longer than really did persist. But when we look at that, and maybe this is also true in other realms as well, if you look at climate change or indeed internet management and so on, what we're lacking is a kind of creativity. What we're lacking is something new. I mean, I don't know how other people feel, but I persistently feel when I am reading things or listening to things on YouTube or whatever that have been recently said about this or that aspect of the relationship, it's kind of, I heard that. When did I hear that? Was that 1985 I heard that? Or was it, when I was still at school? I mean, am I right to feel that there is a kind of a deficiency of creativity around now for approaching these big questions? I'd come to Ian first and then back to Patricia.
It could well be. I may even be part of that. But I think, again, if you take a step back and think about the European security environment, it's about a lot more than relations with Russia. And so it's not only with the traditional Western countries that Russia has a problem. It's unable to create satisfactory relationships with the countries that are its natural partners and should be its best friends around its periphery. So I think this is a bigger question than the relationship between NATO and Russia, for example, or the United States and Russia. There's a lot we can do in the European space to achieve progress which is mutually beneficial, and we ought to be doing a lot more of that in collaboration. The risk is that Russia is entirely outside that, and that's the danger. How to sustain engagement in conditions where it's been decided that there'll be no so-called business as usual in some of the traditional channels. And what Patricia said is absolutely right. Russia is not the Soviet Union, and we're not in a replica of the Cold War. We have many, many different types of engagement, much more openness in many ways than we ever had in the past. So I think this is what's necessary, is to make sure that as Europe as a whole addresses its problems, develops solutions, we don't find that there's just continuous exclusion of Russia on every front from every question. This is not in anybody's interest.
At the same time, and one of the things which your first comment there about Russia has difficulty with, not just with Europe or with the West. Europe has difficulty not just with Russia. So it also has changing relationships. I mean, it has changing relationships internally, and it has changing relationships externally. And is that also part of the picture that needs to be brought in as we think about this?
We're straying far from the INF Treaty, but of course we have lots of internal problems which need to be addressed. There's no question about that. The challenge to the framework that we created in the 1990s is not only coming from Russia, it's also coming from other directions. So definitely we need to be thinking about that and working on that, no question.
Deficiency of creativity, Patricia, back to my first question.
There's huge creativity out there in the real world, right? People doing amazing things in just about every country you can think of. Humans are amazingly creative. It's always strikes me how poorly we're served in our leadership in that regard.
Well, you're coming from Britain, and no, sorry, I won't go there either.
I'm also Irish, so I mean, but it's I think we have had periods in the West of enormous creativity and leadership. It seems to be lacking at the moment. I would say it's also lacking in Russia. I will reserve judgment on China for now. But I think it's important to understand that unless we take initiative, then others will take initiative for us. Unless we have the discussions either on our territory or common territory, others will bring us to their territory. So every time we lose the opportunity to take initiative, to create, to innovate, we're handing it to someone else, because there's plenty of innovation and creativity out there. So what I would like to see is for us to perhaps understand what we've had and build on what we have. Understand that a lot of this is about relationships, and a lot of it is so capacity and technologies all matter, but most importantly it really is about relationships. And how do we develop relationships which don't have to be best friends or agree with everything, but we can live together. And Europe is a really good example of that. We don't have always comfortable relationships amongst our European. Each European country has different histories. It has some long histories of fighting each other, and they may have different visions for going forward. But there's a commitment within Europe to creating a common pathway. So how to use that, if you like, as an example. And I think other areas have been trying to think that. The African Union, I think, has been very much inspired by the European Union, but doing it in a very different way, a very African way. I would love to see, that sort of model taken up in other places. How to cope with bullies, how to cope with very big countries that throw their weight around, is a really difficult problem. How to, manage a bully without becoming a bully is a conundrum that human beings have always had to grapple with, and the answer lies in collectivity. If you have a bully, you create a herd mentality which essentially doesn't allow the lion to pick off the weakest antelope. You create this situation in which you all stand up for each other, and that's the strength, if you like, of NATO.
So I'm going to open it up for questions in a moment. So think what the question would be if you want to put one, and please do. But I have one more question to ask, which is to go from the general, the abstract terms that you were talking in now, which is that we need initiatives, yes. We need innovation, absolutely, tick that. We need creativity, big smiley beside that one. But what would that action be? So are there a couple of sort of concrete things that you can say that it's not just to do with we need creativity or we need cooperation, kind of things I persistently say as well. But here is what we should do.
Yeah, I have a view on it. I think coming back to the issue of the future beyond the INF Treaty, the most important priority which has to be addressed is how to prevent nuclear weapons again becoming a central issue in the European security discourse. So I think the focus on nuclear weapons is entirely appropriate. I think that has to be part of a package which also incorporates the need to accept that there will be a strong element of conventional military deterrence necessary, at least for the foreseeable future. In specific terms, I think one of the things which is very necessary to talk about then is whether it's possible to differentiate between conventional and nuclear-armed ground-launched intermediate-range systems. That's been a conundrum for arms control for a long time. We need to do a lot of thinking about how to do that, because in the future there are probably going to be conventionally armed ground-launched systems, and we need to be able to differentiate those from nuclear-armed systems. And the second thing to think about is whether we could extend the ban on nuclear-armed intermediate-range forces from the land out to the sea. So whether there's any scope for discussing with Russia a prohibition on sea-launched nuclear-armed cruise missiles. I think those are two areas which deserve a lot of close attention in the coming years. Because the fundamental problem is how to prevent nuclear weapons once again establishing themselves as the core element of the European security discourse.
Patricia?
I agree with all of that. I would say that we need to frame it in a much more international way through the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, coming up to its 50th anniversary next year. We have the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which I think is probably going to be under threat in the next few years. So I would like to see a way forward that starts to put back on the agenda that happened a couple of years ago, of course, with the Treaty to Prohibit Nuclear Weapons, the TPNW as it's called, to put that back at the centre of the international agenda again. And that treaty now exists. We have the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference next year. If there's a way in which international leaders could come together and say, you know, we really do have to address the nuclear weapons issue in a more creative way. And, you know, we've seen a number of efforts now. Some of them have led to fruition. Some of them are still, if you like, on that pathway. And some of them are, frankly, dead in the water. So I think that... but if we put that at the centre, we might start to come to something, because the vast majority of the world don't want these weapons around. Every country in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty has agreed to negotiate them away. So I don't see why it is that they've suddenly sort of slipped off the international agenda in this sort of precipitous way that they have.
Right.
And I would get them back in there.
Okay, so in one sense, it's a nuclear weapons focus that you're both talking about in different ways, except in Ian's sense of, or in yours as well, focusing on nuclear weapons in order to be removing them from the central position in our discourse on security issues.
For the obvious reason that the consequences of their use would be so devastating.
So catastrophic, obviously.
And it's hard to find a reason to have them right now.
Right. Okay, yes, Lars-Erik.
Just come with a mic.
Oh, Mike, sorry. And sorry, I know who you are, but please also say who you are, if only for the live stream.
Lars-Erik Lundin. Just a control question. INF, as I understand it, is a parameter, has a parameter which is not nuclear.
Yeah.
It is a generic weapon which can be used with conventional or weapons of mass destruction, both. So, and you said, Ian, that you would like to make it possible to distinguish, so that's one problem I have in delimitation between the nuclear, the dual use, the conventional. How do we deal with that? Because actually what the INF does is to respond to a question about Chinese capabilities in the conventional area as well, and possible Russian interest in developing conventional missile launches for the future around its periphery. So that has, of course, an enormous importance in conventional defense discourse. How do we deal with this? And the other problem, which I just mentioned as well, is where do we put the focus? I hear Americans telling me that we can manage Russia, but the big problem is actually China for the future. Whereas people who are looking at the nuclear issue typically describe Russia and the United States as a big problem and China as a much smaller problem. So I like what Patricia was saying, that we need a more holistic, so to say, with more. We also have the cyber, and we have the more thematic cyber and space issues that come into the picture. But who is going to set this frame of reference for us? It certainly doesn't fit into the current treaty frameworks that we have. We need somehow to find a way to discuss these. Because I also think that we haven't really thought through this. These are some, for the current generation, new questions that come up that they have never been a part of discussing before. Sorry for being long.
No, but thank you for the question. Ian, do you want to take a crack at especially at the first part of that, about the differentiation?
Yeah, it's a reason to continue to pay very close attention to the question of verification within arms control. And that's something which probably in the future has to be done on a different basis than at least in the recent past. If you look at the timeline for INF, and bearing in mind that in its first years, INF had a highly intrusive, very elaborated verification system that was then dismantled when it was felt that there was sufficient trust, because it wasn't considered necessary to bear the costs of such a heavy verification architecture indefinitely.
Ian, sorry, can I interrupt and just ask you to outline that just very briefly, because it was actually really very demanding all through the 90s until whenever it was stopped. And, that's 20 years ago, so it's, maybe out of people's memories. So just a quick couple of headline points about it.
It combined a number of different measures which were completely revolutionary in their time, including continuous presence of US personnel in Russia and Russian personnel in the US, to have continuous portal monitoring of agreed facilities, production sites. So really very intrusive measures. The creation of entirely new institutions for exchange of information, for discussion of all kinds of technical and non-technical compliance issues. So very, very intrusive and extensive verification system which was essentially dismantled. And more or less as soon as it was dismantled, if you look at the timeline, within a very short space of time, it looks like cheating occurred. So if you take that into consideration, it's very unlikely that any future verification system can be based on trust. There isn't going to be any trust. So we have to once again think about these kind of extensive, intrusive measures, which may have to be sustained over very long periods. And that is probably the best way to look at this issue of differentiation. United States and Russia, obviously in particular, are going to have to think carefully about what they're willing to put up with in terms of what could be seen as intrusion on their sovereignty. So I think that verification issue is one that we have to return to, and we have to keep our focus on that. I think that's the issue of the first part of differentiation. In terms of frameworks, you're exactly right. And also, if you think about moving this forward into an environment where you bring in new countries, not just China, but other countries, Not only do we not have a framework, but we have no practical experience. Nuclear arms control has always been essentially bilateral business. Other nuclear armed states, whether they're in the P5 or outside the P5, have a lot of experience with non-proliferation, but they've never negotiated arms control treaties or thought about how to implement verification in the same way that the United States and Russia have. So we're into completely uncharted waters once we move into that future framework. We simply don't know what that would look like.
Patricia, do you want to comment on that? But I also want your thoughts about the Russia and China, which I share.
Well, so I think the international community has negotiated, for example, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which is a very intricate verification system. It's run in a multilateral way in Vienna by the CTBTO. The treaty hasn't entered into force, but the international monitoring system is amazing. It's up and running, and it's doing an incredible job. It's able to pick up, all these seismic vibrations, which might or might not be a nuclear weapons test. So I think there are capabilities within the international system. If we look at the IAEA and the work of the IAEA and the international cadre of inspectors that make sure that nuclear material isn't diverted for weapons purposes, that's a really important role, which I think would come into play in any multilateral approach. So I have a great deal of faith in the possibility of the technical capabilities of the multilateral approach. I think the knowledge within the IAEA and the CTBTO is excellent, and we can build on that, and indeed will do. And I think if we look at the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, that's a very interesting twin-track approach to verification. One is, dismantle first and verify later, which is the South African model, and the other is to go down a road of negotiation within the treaty in order to develop a multilateral approach with the IAEA and perhaps some P5 involvement. I think that's yet to be decided. So it's a really interesting approach that the international community has taken to that. In terms of the bigger picture, we have a lot of non-proliferation problems around the world. We have obviously the issue with Iran, which the European Union has been absolutely central to. I love the fact that it's been holding firm in the wake of what's happened with President Trump. I think that shows great resolve and commitment, however difficult it might be. I think with North Korea, it's been a much more different issue, and we've yet to see how that might play out. But I think, again, we have seen cooperation in the Security Council. We've seen great cooperation in very stressful times between China and the United States on this, because it's in their interest. So where we can't agree, so there's an old phrase, isn't there? Where we can agree, where we can't negotiate, right? And I think that this is the human condition. We will never always be able to agree with each other on everything, but we can negotiate all the time and set that negotiation in process. And we've got the great negotiator in the White House right now, so I'm expecting him to be out there negotiating all over the place for international security. It's about putting security right at the heart and centre of what we do. And I think Ian's quite right about verification. There are ways in which you can discriminate between a nuclear-armed cruise missile and a non-nuclear-armed cruise missile. It's very intrusive. But back in the 80s, people were doing that work and could have done it. Now the technologies are even better. And they can be done without revealing secrets. The easiest way, of course, is to say no nuclear weapons. And then you don't have that problem. You've got another problem, but you don't have that particular problem. And indeed, verifying making sure that something is absent is always much easier than measuring how much is there.
Thomas?
Yeah. Thank you very much. My name is Thomas Jonter. I'm Professor of International Relations here at Stockholm University. Excellent discussion, but missing an elephant in the room. You refer very much to about deterrence, different kinds of deterrence, and you, Patricia, said we have to understand the full spectrum of deterrence. And Ian was defining what is deterrence. You said assurance has some kind of component of response. It must be included, a response, otherwise it doesn't work. And the second criteria was broad participation. As I see it, I think it's more like a bipolar deterrence concept at work here in the discussion. And I would like to hear a little bit more about this INF Treaty issue is taking place in a new global context. We all understand that. What does it mean in terms of deterrence? Does deterrence, as we knew it or know it today, work at all? Or that is going on between United States and Russia is a way to find new ways to understanding deterrence, emerging deterrence in a sense. Somebody referred to China. Yes, China has to be included in the picture, but I need to understand a little bit more what you think about deterrence. Does it work at all today?
Deterrence in a changing world order. I mean, in one way, this also plays on the question which I asked about, is the rivalry for real? Three great powers, two of them are the largest and the second largest economies in the world, and they will probably swap positions in about 10 or 11 years. That's the IMF projection. Russia is has the 12th largest national economy in the world. That's behind an awful lot of countries, way outside of the G7. So it is a different kind of power from China and the US in one sense, and a similar kind of power perhaps to the US in another in terms of armaments. But how are the classic relationship that we were talking about during the Cold War, and the terminology which we use is still very much the same, even while we recognize that 3 decades on from the Cold War, and 4 decades of Chinese fast-paced development behind us now, things must have changed. So have a stab at that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we were very lazy all the way through the Cold War. The word deterrence came to mean nuclear. And in fact, to the point in the UK that they don't even bother to call Trident a missile or a weapon, the missile, they call it the deterrent. Right? And what it is, it's a nuclear weapon, it's a nuclear-tipped missile. I would like to call things as they are. To deter, one needs to understand what deters and what we are deterring, what behavior we're deterring. And that means understanding the mind of the other. It means understanding that there's some kind of shared understanding and shared belief system. There may or may not have been in the Cold War. There is a lot of evidence which suggests that nuclear weapons did not deter. There's a little bit of evidence that suggests they might have deterred. There is very little evidence in the public domain that says they did deter throughout the Cold War. So immediately I have to question, did they ever deter? Was it just imagined? If it was just imagined, was that enough? Maybe it was. Maybe they played a role. Maybe they didn't play a role. Then we have to question, do they play a role today? Or do other things deter more? Do economic sanctions deter more? Do conventional weapons deter more? Does being united deter more? Very interesting recent data points where we've seen united action in international organizations such as the UN Security Council, such as the OPCW, the Organization for Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, to see that united action really having quite a massive impact on those that we would wish to stop certain types of behavior. Did it work? I don't know. We often don't know until a long time after the event, and then it's usually so intricately bound up with other things that we'd never be 100% sure what it was. There are many scholars who believe that the European Union has provided much more of a deterrence capability to prevent war than NATO, for example. And there are those who would say, no, it's the collective action of NATO that has done it. And the truth is, somewhere both of them have played a role, right? It's not one or the other.
But let me, before passing on...
What I'm saying is we really need to understand what we mean, and we mustn't be lazy with our terminology. We need to understand what we mean by to deter, and we need to unravel that and be quite clear about what we can and cannot deter.
And there's nothing I like better than a good terminological dispute. So before I pass this on to Ian, I'm going to ask you whether, in fact, you're not using the term deterrence way too broadly. Right? That actually it is not only about deterring behavior, which means that something which some state or actor is doing or might be doing is stopped. right? It's also, actually, international relations are also about persuasion. And they're also about both directly and indirectly encouraging behavior. And that, that's where the concept of soft power starts to come into the picture. That there are ways in which it is possible to have influence that are not to do with the military instrument and are not necessarily even to do with explicitly stated government positions by this or that state, but they're because, we want to be on their side because they're nice. And I just feel in what, EU having a deterrent capability, actually I would argue no. The EU does have a conflict prevention capacity, but we have felt that capacity through encouragement and persuasion and example and soft power elements, and occasionally through economic weight. Right.
I said there were others who would say. I mean, I wasn't saying that I would agree with that. I'm just saying that I think that we have got very lazy over terminology, and I agree with you. I would like to see us do more on the persuasion front, just as I would like to see us do more on diplomacy. Diplomacy and persuasion are very cost-effective ways of creating a more secure environment. And it's about unpacking all of that and not just reverting back to the whole military and deterrence and defense approach, perhaps, and having a much better mix and a much better understanding of what works today rather than 30, 40 years ago.
So I've almost forgotten what the question was, which I was going to pass to you at this moment, but I think it was something to do with deterrence in the context of a changing world order.
Yeah. When I was talking about deterrence in the opening remarks, Thomas, I was simply feeding back how NATO itself views extended deterrence. I completely agree that it has to be modified in changing conditions, but the idea itself is relatively straightforward. That it's a conditional response. That it's avoiding a situation where you can face a contingency to which you have no answer. And I think 2014, from that point of view, was really a watershed. And the recognition after what happened in Crimea that if there was a repetition of that somewhere else, there was no adequate response already prepared. That's not a prediction that something would happen. It's not an assessment that something is probable, but it's a recognition that if it did happen, there was complete lack of preparedness. And so after 2014, what's happened is the construction of a conditional response. And nuclear weapons are one part of that. They're not the totality by any means. And in fact, again, feeding back NATO's own perspective on deterrence, that changed very radically already in the 1960s, where the idea was to create a range of flexible options and not to have a situation where nuclear weapons were the exclusive element of deterrence. And that was obviously a response to Cuba, to the Berlin crises. And so, in fact, the main plank of deterrence is the coherence of the alliance. But nuclear weapons have a part to play in that. And that's what really, I think, is likely to be the focus of discussion in the coming year or two when NATO thinks through its response to the post-INF European security environment.
Pierre at the back. Oh, just the mic.
Pierre Schori, chairman of the Olof Palme Fund. Olof Palme, who coined the doctrine of common security. I would like to remind us of the background, the political background to the INF Treaty, which was deterrence and dialogue, Willy Brandt's Ostpolitik, and the concept of common security. You have to sit down with your enemy to discuss balanced reductions. Now, when we are gathering here and others, we're talking about military responsible. It seems to be mainly, which I think is wrong. There must be a political response to this. And also, we see here how NATO is responding to Trump pulling out of the INF, saying this is Putin is to blame. And that is repeated by so-called military experts here in Sweden too. While if you read, and Patricia was referring to some of them, the Democratic leadership in the Congress, they said immediately after Trump announced this, They said, US pulling out of the INF, rewarding Putin and hurting NATO. And I think they are right. So if we were to accept what Trump is doing by blaming Putin, then we don't know what the next step will be after the INF. It will be a slippery slope. We have first the recognition of Jerusalem, then comes the Golan Heights, and then comes the West Bank. And you will have the similar things now with low-yield nuclear arms, etc., etc. So we must come up with a political response here. And we stopped by popular resistance the SS-20 and the Pershings. And we need also a political response here, and not joining NATO for Sweden's part, getting up 2%, or not even signing the UN Treaty on nuclear bans, the most idiotic thing of all objections. So we should instead find political responses, and all this creativity you find about the military experts here, and in SIPRI also, why not have a seminar about the political responses to the INF Treaty too? So, and then finally on the AI. I mean, no human being can beat the deep blue, the new deep blue versions in chess anymore. This will get out of control, and it will also affect the whole nuclear issue. And therefore, we have to focus on the nuclear, and we have to have a political response, and popular pressure, and governmental pressure. And we should not just think about rearming NATO again, more defense and so on. Thank you.
I mean, in one way, you could say, Pierre, that if NATO leaders decide to, NATO European leaders decide to depict the problems of the INF Treaty in a certain way that blames Putin, and they go for a military response, that is actually their political response. So, I mean, there is politics in this all the time. None of this is technical. It is all fundamentally political, and it comes down to views about Russia, about Europe, also views, which I think we've also been talking about a lot, about nuclear weapons and about conventional weapons. And possibly it comes down to what, in my view, would be a failure to recognize the risks which are entailed in the very existence of nuclear weapons. I mean, that is why the Article 6 of the NPT is the Non-Proliferation Treaty is so important, because that's the moment, in a sense, where you see non-proliferation as an arms control measure should be transformed into non-proliferation as part of a disarmament program. And that, I think, I mean, that is to do with the politics of the present situation and the present crisis. And I think you're right to draw out this political dimension and to emphasize it. But I mean, that is where, in a way, Patricia, when you talk about creativity and initiative and innovation, you're looking for something in the political world, whether at large, as between the great powers, or at a much more local level, as all of us, and the kind of bottom-up diplomacy, which was also a part of the story at the end of the Cold War.
Exactly. I think that's right. We're seeing that sort of creative leadership, for example, when it comes to climate change.
Yes.
I mean, it's not perfect, but it's people have understood that there's a very big problem. And I think that was what happened probably in the 80s and early 90s. People understood there was a very big problem, and they brought their great creative minds to it. And part of the problem is that people have forgotten for a long time what a big problem this is. And a few countries have kept the flame alive and moved ahead with that sense of urgency, and perhaps saw the writing on the wall earlier than others. I'm talking about those that negotiated the treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons. So I think that whether or not you agree with what they achieved or their approach, I do think that they had prescience in a way that others haven't had at that time. I think, though, if I could address your topic on AI and artificial intelligence, I don't think we can say we have to squash it. I'm afraid it's already there. And so what we have to understand with these technologies is that these technologies can do things that we're not very good at. They can cope with huge amounts of data at very high speed. We can't do that. Our brains are not wired for that. These machines we've created, if you like, compensate for our brains' inabilities. So if we can find a way to make sure that these machines can do that for us and help us, then I think we have created something, another set of technologies which will be really helpful in the world. And they already are helping us in terms of, you know, helping us decide on how much gas to store, really sensitive energy grid decisions that's being made, and therefore really helping with climate change. That's just one example. So I think it's not about trying to squash down these technologies. We won't succeed in that. It's about really understanding them and really making sure that the decisions that we make about these technologies are decisions that we're all party in and involved in making, and making the right sort of decisions through our understanding. Don't step away from these technologies. Really try to understand them. Don't go, oh, it's too complicated. It isn't actually. It's not that difficult. Just look at them in the eye and take them on and try to understand and try to think about how we can engage with these technologies and use them for our benefit.
We've been referring for some time to these technologies here as, at SIPRI, we're calling them emerging technologies. And yeah, after a while I decided to change that. I'm now referring to them as newly emerged technologies. And fairly soon we'll probably just call them technologies, because they are, indeed, as you say, they're a part of our reality.
But we're about to go quantum, which will
change
the landscape completely. Quantum computing increases the power of these technologies enormously and the capabilities they have. Quantum communications really gives us a type of security in communications in space at the moment, which will transform our capabilities in secure communications. And then there are other types of quantum technologies which enhance our capabilities, for example, Earth observation, radar, and so on. These are fantastic. And here the EU has done some amazing stuff and has developed what they call the quantum flagship, and is investing enormous amounts of money into all these new quantum technologies in Europe. And I see that as a really big step up for Europe, and kudos to the EU for having done that.
Ian?
Yeah, actually, just to respond to the point, I think from a European perspective, we have a political strategy. It uses different language now, but it's not so different from the principles on which common security was based, and we call it effective multilateralism. And in some contexts, consistently pursuing this approach of effective multilateralism is going to lead to tensions or confrontations, perhaps even with the United States. But in this particular area, I don't see any reason why it should. If it's correct that over the past few years, while the INF Treaty has been in place, Russia has developed and deployed 60 to 100 nuclear-armed missiles which are not compliant with the treaty, you simply can't turn a blind eye to that without making the principles on which effective multilateralism are based ridiculous. So there has to be a response, and it applies also in other areas of arms control. It's not possible to make the case for effective multilateralism and turn a blind eye to confirmed use of chemical weapons in the face of the Chemical Weapons Convention. So we have to have a consistent, principled approach to effective multilateralism as a collective European strategy.
But look at the difference. So with chemical weapons, what we did was we went into the international organization, the OPCW, and made it tighter, created a situation in which now attribution will be part of the whole process. So we strengthened the international system. We didn't withdraw from the treaty, right? That to me is the big difference. So, you know, if we want the rules-based order, let's strengthen it, not just... so withdraw from the treaty once you've got another one in place, right? Maybe. That's fine. You know, supersede a treaty. That's great. But, you know, don't leave a gaping hole in the rules-based international order, because when there's a gaping hole, there'll be a little vacuum, and then someone's going to move in and exploit it. And that's what's happening now. And it seems to me that that was a trap, which I'm still hoping for the miracle of someone coming along and helping the people out of the hole that they've dug themselves into.
Yeah.
Well, the dynamics of the Chemical Weapons Convention were to force through, in the teeth of strong opposition from a group of countries who were opposed to the decisions, exactly the decisions that you're talking about related to attribution. So the dynamic was quite different from the CWC tradition of consensus decision making.
It was, that's true. And that's the reality of the world in which we now find ourselves. But I think that it nonetheless showed that there were a large number of countries really willing to support the convention and prevent the use of chemical weapons, whether that be in Syria or whether that be in Salisbury. Right? And I think that's really important, to stand up for what is the core purpose of that treaty.
So although we didn't spend really any time at all talking about, why the INF Treaty, why the US withdrew from the INF Treaty, we haven't talked about responsibility very much. We've mentioned it in terms of part of the political strategy and the propaganda game. But what do you think, Patricia, given that at the very least, to put this at the sort of the most conservative level, US intelligence had and has information which it believed and believes shows that Russia was and is non-compliant with the INF Treaty. What do you think would have been the appropriate response, having that information, that you feel would be consistent both with the terms of the treaty and with what you've emphasized, and which I think totally agree with, I'm sure Ian does as well, the need for a rules-based international order? Mm-hmm. What would be the practical thing that could have been done instead of withdrawal?
Right. Well, so I think the way I would have gamed it was I would have said, well, what's being tried to be what was Russia trying to achieve with this? So this is a weapons system which the Obama administration first, brought to the world's attention. It's straight over the line in terms of the capability that's prohibited by the INF Treaty. Let's accept that that's the case. So. Is it a material breach? Yes. Is it an imminent threat to world security? No. Right. Could it be? Possibly. So it's something that's important. So then what you have to do is, it seems to me, is have a timeline in which you're going to look at this. So the Obama administration did all the right things in terms of, addressing the issue, bringing it up, etc. And of course, then it was deployed, and that made it a different thing. So, having deployed, then it did, and that was then Trump who then President Trump, who had to make a decision. In my view, that clock hadn't run out in terms of trying to achieve within the treaty what you might want to achieve. The Special Verification Commission. I know, for example, many experts. In Germany, in other parts of Europe, we're looking at confidence-building measures. We're looking at special inspections. Were all of those things tried? Holding Russia's feet to the fire, using international law to keep on calling them out, rather than withdrawing from a treaty, which I agree you have to do something, but when you withdraw from the treaty, then you essentially let them off the hook. So what do you achieve there? Yes, you can create a sort of public shaming, but is that public shaming working in Russia? Is that what the Russian people think is going on, or do they think, President Trump pulled out of the INF Treaty? Mm-hmm. So I think that's the problem we have, and I would have gone much further down the road. If it were an imminent problem which was about to be used, that's a completely different situation. But in this case, I would say I would have used the way in which, if you like, we used international law with the OPCW, and I would have taken it into the United Nations. I would have called it out at the Security Council, every available opportunity to expose the issue and force Russia into talking about it.
Ian? Would that response have satisfied you? Would you have thought that it was enough, or would you have would you been hard line on it?
Hard line. Of course, you can always make the case that you could postpone for 6 months or a year or 2 years or whatever. But for as long as the treaty is in force, it's not possible to be compliant and begin putting in place the measures that you may consider to be necessary in light of non-compliance by the other party. So withdrawal, in a sense, is a precondition for some of the preparations which we're now seeing turned into decisions.
Well, what would you have liked to have seen in the first place, going back, 2015?
Of course, the best outcome would be complete compliance and uncontested compliance with the treaty. None of us is happy that the treaty is going. Of course, the best solution would have been for the treaty to remain in force, be complied with, and that would have been the best outcome. But we're not there.
We've got time for a final couple of questions, and either I can ask them both or somebody else can ask at least one of them. Anybody else? Yes, please, Ambassador.
Thank you very much. Well, actually, we don't want to be seen as an outsider because I'm from Asia. If something happened, like the INF fail, and then the nuclear war happened, and the victims will be all of us. There's a majority of population in the world. But you see that European is a kind of oasis for all of us, including for ASEAN, 10 countries in ASEAN. We do have ARF, ASEAN Regional Forum, and exactly this is the criteria and the determinant that we have to solve the problem to preventive diplomacy, and then confidence building and conflict resolution. And this inspired a lot of us. So the creativity is there, and I totally agree on this. And all inclusive. It's not only just, because we are talking with the political landscape with 1987. It's only 2 countries. It's no longer a country because Russian is federation. So for us, you mentioned about new artificial intelligence or artificial technologies, if you like, and new players also, emerging countries and China also. Put everyone in the board, all inclusive, and see what we can do. And use the P5, and I know that now we have Belgium, Germany, Poland, and they are very active. In Germany this year, this month is the president of P5. So I'm hopeful that this will solve a lot of...
President of the Security Council.
Absolutely, yes, you're right. And the threat, the future threat is, the scarcity, water scarcity, as you have a very good research on that issue. Thank you very much.
So, I mean, the inclusivity issue, do you think it is necessary as one, take this as a challenge to be creative again, looking at this horizon, this scanning the situation in the post-INF world, looking at trying to reconstruct arms control arrangements, trust, confidence, maybe confidence without trust, but confidence based on very strong verification and so on. Thinking towards the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference in the middle of next year, as you were talking about. Do you think this we need to be opening up to more actors to be playing a leading, leadership role in this whole area? Is that one of the sources for new creativity, for new initiatives, for innovation?
It's definitely part of it. If there is any positive to come out of what's happened around the INF Treaty, and it's hard to find anything very positive, but if there is, then it's the recognition that we need to have a dialogue with Asian countries about global security. Because INF Treaty was a comprehensive agreement which covered the whole territory of the Soviet Union as it was then. So I think it's really put the finger on this as a gap in the existing international discourse on security. So we do need to bring into the European discussion or forge some common discussion, Europe-Asia, I think, on these questions.
Yeah, I think we get the best creativity from diversity. So I'd like to see more women in our work, for one thing. I think I would like to see more people from different countries who have quite different solutions. The ASEAN way is one. I think it works culturally. These things are very cultural. And, a lot of our rules-based system is a very Western cultural. That doesn't mean that it has to remain that way. It doesn't mean that the rules won't work for everyone. But, they ought to be open up to challenge, I think. And it's important for us to bring in more voices so that we end up with something which gets more ownership and support throughout the world. And here's where I think the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is particularly good in some respects, except for the 5 that are still, for some reason, allowed to keep them for a temporary period. And then we have the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, the Chemical Weapons Convention. These were all negotiated multilaterally in a genuine way and are shepherded through the international system multilaterally. And I think that this multilateral approach, while it can be cumbersome, it's a bit like the multi-stakeholder approach that we see in cybersecurity in the internet governance space, where you get, and we're seeing it also in space as well, this, you know, private partnership with government, with non-governmental organizations, and you get this sort of tumbleweed effect, where, you know, the tumbleweed goes down the road, no one makes a decision, but somehow you do get down the road, and everyone's still with you. And it's difficult and hard to manage, but it is creative and innovative, and everybody's part of it, and you've got lots of different voices. So it actually has, I think, a stronger likelihood of being sustainable.
So at the end of all this, Ian, are you optimistic about where things could go, or are you just miserable?
No, it's not miserable at all. Again, I think it's useful to try and take a step back and get a sense of perspective. If we think in broad terms about the developments of European security, we see extremely positive trajectory. Yeah. Some of the things which even a few years ago, we would have thought would be extraordinary, such as the close relationship being forged between NATO and the European Union. These are very positive developments. It's still the part of the world, it's the world region where we still have the highest levels of peace, prosperity, stability. So I think in general terms there's no reason to be pessimistic, but there's every reason to be concerned about the drift back towards military factors becoming a dominant feature in the European discourse, and in particular the fact that nuclear weapons begin to become a central feature of that military discourse.
Right.
So this is a tough nut that we have to crack, but there's no reason to be pessimistic about the future of European security.
Patricia?
I think there are much bigger problems out there as well. I mentioned climate change. I would put nuclear weapons in them that we have left unsolved for the next generation. Having said that, though, what I know about the next generation from, you know, everyone I work with, my own kids, that they are amazing. And I'm really sorry, that generation, that you're going to inherit this. But I also am pleased that you're going to inherit it, because I think that they do have this creativity and this sense of what's important. And we're seeing that now with the, you know, school strikes on climate change and the mobilization that we're seeing amongst the young. And in a way, they remind me of us in the 80s, in the sense that they understand the world in an international way. And maybe the internet's had something to play in there. And they're going to come up with solutions. They have that innovation. They have that creativity. So everyone in this room, I think we now have to thank the next generation for our certainty in their ability to solve our problems.
But before you go out and find the next generation and thank them for the solutions which they're going to produce, you also need to thank our two panelists for their contributions this afternoon. So thanks very much indeed. And thank you all for coming, and welcome to the next time that we invite you out here. Thanks a lot, everybody.